Hey everyone, we are trying something new on the channel today, and I wanted to say a few things before I got started with the conversation with Scott. The first thing is, I wanted to apologize to Scott because we originally recorded this interview in July, and I'm only releasing it like 6 months later or 5 months later. So, yeah, better late than never, I guess. The second thing, and probably the most important thing, is that Scott Young has this new book out. It's called Get Better at Anything. Came out in early summer, I believe. And I just want to say, in case this gets lost in our conversation, that I highly recommend this book. It's comprehensive. It's clearly written. It covers just so much ground in the research on learning. So I would definitely recommend adding this book to your collection of books about learning. And the last thing I want to say is I just want to apologize for the poor sound quality on my end. I've already made improvements on future videos that I have recorded and I'm planning to release, so that'll get better over time. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoy it. It's a bit of a rambling conversation, so maybe some of you like that. If you don't like it, that's totally cool too. All right, see you soon. Today, we're really lucky to have with us Scott Young, who is a best-selling author and who has been blogging about learning for close to 20 years or roughly in that
it feels weird
area.
to say, but yeah.
And he has a new book out. It's called Get Better at Anything, and so he was nice enough to come on the channel and talk about it.
Well, you were nice enough to have me on your channel, so thank you, Ben. Yeah.
Of course. I have a couple of questions, and then we can just talk about whatever you want to talk about as we answer these questions. But my first question, which is like, hey, we have this new book out. You already wrote a book about learning.
Yes.
And then you're writing another one, and you've been writing about learning online for a while and reading the research. You're already familiar with some of the research for a while.
Yeah.
What's up with this book? Why did you write this book?
Well, part of it is that, like, when you write a first book, you're very much like you're kind of taking sort of your personal experience, that's like a very common path to writing a book, is that like you have some personal experiences. So in my case, it was doing some of these intensive learning projects, which became the kind of book Ultra Learning. But I mean, even if you're an academic, like you do some sort of research, and then like that research becomes your book and this kind of thing. So I'd done that, but that focus of doing these sort of intensive learning projects, I felt like it missed this huge space of like ways people learn, different situations that it matters. There were so many ideas that like didn't fit into that framework that I wanted to explore. And so I started researching, and I was like getting interested in writing another book. And I just kept researching, and it was a little bit like I just went down like, many rabbit holes and read like hundreds of papers and stuff. And so when I kind of came up to the surface, it was sort of like, well, how can I summarize this? How can I put this in some framework that, a person who's not going to read all those books would maybe understand? And I mean, I think also part of the motivation for me doing this is that even though I've been writing about it for 20 years and I always try to follow the research, unlike yourself, I didn't go and get a PhD studying this. And so this was sort of like, in some ways, like my chance to do the deep dive and learn a lot of the, the background theory, a lot of the ideas that maybe you wouldn't cover if you were just going to write like a little essay about something. You wouldn't necessarily read some like dense textbook on, methods that they use for studying something, like that kind of thing. So it was also an excuse to do that. But I feel like the book was a chance for me to kind of bring some of those ideas together and share them with people. And hopefully people will like it. Yeah.
I liked it. I thought it was good, which is why I have you on.
So we're all good. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, man.
Given that you already had this background and then you did this deep dive, were there things that surprised you or were like, oh, wait, I didn't know that was the case, or that's surprising, or that's different than what I thought? Or was it pretty much like, yeah, I get the big picture, I'm just filling in the details,
When I wrote Ultra Learning, I had a specific kind of approach and way of thinking about learning projects. I don't think that changed so much in encountering all this research. But there were a few things that I, not that like I didn't know, but I didn't like fully appreciate until I went into some of the research. So some of the things that I thought were really fascinating were related to how much we're kind of dependent on other people for learning. And that kind of becomes the opening of this book because, obviously in an educational context, if you're talking about it in school, there's the teacher, there's the students. It's like, how do we get the students to like want to learn what we want to learn? How do we get them to like think about it? But I've always come at it from the opposite perspective. if you're sort of self-motivated and you want to learn something, then one of the big problems is like you don't know the thing that you want to learn. So how do you like solve this bootstrapping problem of learning it? And so thinkers that were sort of I think really challenged some of my, maybe my naivete or some of my attitudes before, where people like John Sweller and Paul Kirchner and people like that who have this kind of, well, no, that is a central problem of learning, is that the student doesn't have the knowledge, and if they have to like really work extremely hard to get the knowledge, that can be quite inefficient. Now I know obviously with your experience working with Dean Schwartz or Daniel Schwartz and others, like you have your own perspective on it, and I'd love to like compare notes at some point. But that was something that surprised me, because I feel like I came at it from the, it's all practice. Anders Ericsson was my guy,
Right.
like this kind of thing, to be like, oh yeah, but if you don't have good examples, or if you don't have good, like, you can get on these sort of like detours and get really stuck. So that was something that I thought was really interesting. And so I wanted to try to surface that, because it didn't really fit in the last book. Yeah.
I feel like it's strange because not strange. It's interesting because I feel like
Yeah.
my baseline was kind of more on the Sweller Kirshner side of things, where I felt like
we're meeting in the middle. Yeah.
you need to like, obviously you need
Yeah.
this structure, you need this guidance, you need everything. And so then when I started encountering some other stuff in grad school, I was like, oh, this is really surprising, or this is really different.
Yeah.
So we've kind of not exactly flipped sides,
No,
but we've
met
come
in the
at it,
middle.
I think, from different angles.
Well, we also, I know both of us, as far as I can tell, are fans of like retrieval practice and, like Karpicki's work and like this kind of stuff on testing effect. And so I think there is like, I didn't make the entire book that, the entire book, the chapter, the book wasn't, John Sweller was right about everything, was not the title of the book.
That was chapter number 3. I think that was it. And then the book ended abruptly.
We're done, guys. We're done. No, but I think that line of research sort of clued me into an important perspective. And so you can see this reflected in a lot of the educational practice, that like, for instance, when students are learning to read, this sort of whole word kind of like, let them learn to love reading and don't drill them too much, which, I mean, my parents taught in elementary school, so I heard them say stuff like this. So I'm not even, this is in the milieu in my background. And then you read all this research, you're like, nah, you need to teach them phonics. Phonics is what actually works. And the fact that this has been kind of like, had to have been rediscovered many times, like it's not just been like, well, we've settled the debate and everyone switches their opinions. I think that was very fascinating for me, and so I wanted to include it. But of course, like the book, the framework I have, I include like the sort of active learning and the feedback, because I think those things are so important. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective of like what you think I'm missing after I did this thing, or what you think you would conceptualize it differently.
I have some thoughts, but I don't.
I'm putting you on the spot now.
I don't have any. I don't have anything like nothing. I mean, one of the things that I liked about the book is that nothing jumped out at me as being wrong immediately. Which is like, sometimes when I'm reading things and I'm like, oh my gosh, like no, and I'm a very like, I get like the legal training that you go through kind of gets you very annoyed at very small problems that as you leave the legal field, you realize, wow, this is like fundamentally changed my personality in maybe a bad way, because you get so detail oriented and you kind of work yourself up over these things. But no, I was really, I mean, I think I had told you in a previous conversation.
That's high praise. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it if I didn't think it was true.
The typical reader is not that close a reader. Like, they're just sort of like, oh yeah, you sort of said this, right? But I've definitely come to appreciate that, scientists, especially the people when you're like citing their work, one of the practices I got involved in, I started doing with the last book, is like, if you're going to cite someone's paper, you should just mention what you're saying about it and see if they have any comments. And every once in a while, they'll say, well, no, it's actually this, not this. And it's like something that you think is like so like picayune,
what's
like
the difference?
Like, why? Like, who cares, right? Like, I basically said that, right? But the way I feel about it is that like someone spent years of their life getting it right so they could write that paper, and for you to just be like, well, it was sort of this, is really doing a disservice to what they're doing. So I appreciate that, at least from your cursory glance, not doing the vetting it so much. It doesn't appear to be too bad.
No. I mean, I think it's great. I mean, I think like the differences between people who I think go in and look at the research deeply are almost like they are. I mean, they're not exactly just personal preferences, but they're almost like it's like, oh, just the way I've organized things is a little bit different, or the way you've organized things is a little bit different than some, like, and it's not that things are missing. It's just like, as I remember, as I was reading the book, and of course, one of the things that I find fascinating about writing books in general is like, out of all of the millions of different ways I mean, there aren't millions, but maybe like dozens of different ways maybe of organizing the material. It's like, you have to pick one. You have to pick a certain way to go. And then the rest of the structure, other potential structures are kind of hidden in the book, that you try to link, try to indicate to people that, by the way, this is kind of connected to this thing that we talked about 3 chapters ago, but I didn't put them next to each other because, like, I chose another path. And so,
but that's a good point, though. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say that's a good point, because one of the main challenges of coming up with a framework for this is that the way that academic research is organized is not the way that would like make sense for someone necessarily applying it practically. Like, there are some cases where, like, people who study learning physics or learning reading, that is very like topic specific. But often you have, people, especially at the basic level, not the applied level, like the basic level, you have people studying different phenomena that are like kind of defined by like, that's the sort of their research interest, and like the sort of the way the literature is organized is by, cognitive mechanism or like this kind of thing. And so, you have things where like, well, in practical advice, these 3 things are related, but in terms of the research, they're like really far apart. And so that's partly my reorganization. Is thinking about, well, the person who's not a researcher who's reading this book, I'm hoping that this structure would be helpful for them. But it would be interesting to hear what you would think of as like, that's not how I would think about it,
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say earlier, like in an earlier conversation, we had been talking about this, and it is the kind of thing where it's like, in the back of my head sometimes I'm like, oh, but he didn't mention this yet. He's probably forgot about this thing, and then you turn a few pages and it's like, oh, wait, here's this. I mean, we had mentioned a cognitive task analysis as an example of this, which is a phrase I don't think I have uttered yet on YouTube, but which it deserves CTA. A fair amount of attention. And it feels, it's always weird when you try to take this academic construct and try to be like, hey, this is really important, but it sounds really obtuse, and it also is like, it's, I mean, going back to what you were talking about with the perspective of learning versus, like a lot of the research is from the teaching perspective, and like if you are an autodidact and you're trying to learn stuff on your own, it's like that, the fact that like you can't really do it. This is really important and you can't do it. Sorry.
It'd be really nice if Siegfried Engelmann could design you the perfect curriculum to study exactly these things, but it doesn't exist, so you're on your own. Like that was my feeling reading his book, is like, well, this is the right way to teach this subject. And it's like, yeah, but I don't have that, so okay, sorry.
I mean, I don't. It's strange because the bootstrapping that you were talking about earlier. I mean, I do see that as a fundamental issue, and that the observation of one of your first 3 bullet points, C. So the C. So Scott's organizational framework in the book is C, do, feedback.
We probably should have mentioned that, right?
Pardon?
Going into describing it, we probably should have mentioned what the
we probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. But it's funny because I misremembered it when I was writing it down before the interview again as observe. And it's like, it's so fancy, uses observe as a word, rather than see. But I feel like like the observation of the skill, the knowledge, I mean, like, something's got to be there from the expert's perspective, so that the learner can even kind of know what to do or what direction to go in.
Well, and I mean, part of the problem with the C-do feedback as a framework, and I mean, this is just like there's going to be a problem with any framework, is that like anytime you use a word, people have like kind of a narrow view of it. So the narrow view of it is like, well, oh, you're talking about apprenticeship, like you just watch someone do it. And it's pretty clear that for a lot of cognitive skills, because they're going on in someone's head, like that's why I have that whole chapter about that, but it's going on in someone's head, you can't see it, right? So you need them to verbalize it or articulate it or like break it down in some way. So that's, certainly if you're a physicist, like you're not learning much by just like watching them scribble on the chalkboard, like there's more there. And then also the feedback one is another one too, where like in the kind of, I think most people in the sort of cognitive sciences would take a kind of broader view of feedback of like just any information coming out from the environment. But I've had these conversations with people where they think, oh no, feedback is literally just someone telling you like you did a bad job.
Or that's wrong.
And like that's what Scott says you need. And you need more people criticizing you. And it's sort of like, well, actually no, maybe not. But so it's interesting. So, but I mean, the thing that I felt like I wanted to front load the book with was just this idea of like, the cumulative nature of knowledge, the fact that we're a cultural species, like all these little puzzle pieces sort of fit together of like, okay, the first step is like, how do you get to a point where you can like quickly learn what is the best practice in a field, or what is the knowledge of the field, or like avoid a lot of those mistakes that were made by people who really were at the frontier or had to troubleshoot it. And I mean, I think we can kind of go back and forth about like how much you want to be doing your own problem solving on the way to that. But I think it's clear you need something like that. You can't just be like, okay, reinvent calculus. It's just not going to work, right?
The focus on individual learning is kind of seen as a separate thing than the research on the growth of knowledge, which, you can read stuff on like science studies and the history of science. And then there's information studies. And I mean, there's a bunch of different disciplines that focus on this question of knowledge management and like growth over time in terms of organizations and societies. And then there's like, the kind of the stuff that I make YouTube videos about, the stuff that you write blog posts about. It's like, oh, this little like individual person, what are they doing? In my mind, these are very interconnected fields, more interconnected than I think is generally acknowledged. And, that was something that I really liked about the book, is that you're bringing in these stories of kind of like, hey, how did someone learn this in the first place, kind of, versus how are we learning it, after Leibniz and Newton have invented calculus, it's different for us now. And we should take advantage of all of the material and the insight that people have generated about both the nature of the subject, but also about how to teach it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting for me too, because like if you think about, I don't know, I have a friend who has a math blog called Better Explained, and he likes to use this example of like, pick any math concept that you did in like middle school, and at some point that was like PhD thesis level work, right? The idea of negative numbers. It was just like, what, negative numbers? But like someone had to like really think hard to come up with that idea, right? Or even zero was like not an idea for a while, of like, well, that doesn't even make sense, right? So when you're struggling with imaginary numbers or differential equations or this kind of thing, like you're just getting such a benefit from the fact that someone has found a good way to think about this. And if you can learn the right way to think about it, then that's helpful. And I think, I feel like my understanding, my kind of gestalt of the literature when I was looking at it, is that the debate seems to be between people who think you should be like as strongly guiding it as possible, like telling like, this is the calculus equation, do it this way, like that kind of very traditional approach, versus the Manu Kapoors and the productive failure, and even your association with Daniel Schwartz and these kind of people who are sort of like, well, maybe it makes sense if kids or students sort of see the problem scenario so they can kind of see what motivated the right answer, and then you kind of bring in the right answer and be like, this is a good way of doing it, and they're like, oh yeah, that is a good way of doing it. And so, but to me, those things are both so close on the spectrum of like, you have some kind of educational guidance compared to what actually Newton and Leibniz were doing when they were inventing calculus, which is like, well, there's no teacher there. They're just got to figure it out. They're coming up with different notations and,
Yeah.
fighting each
Yeah.
other over priority and this kind of thing,
Yeah. Well, I will ask you this: if you take the group of people who have, you know, have a decently strong grasp of the research on learning and instruction, and you actually ask them, like, they might debate bitterly these things in journal articles and everything like that. But if you just presented a situation to them and are like, hey, this is what the teacher did, this is what the students did, like, how could it be different or how could it be improved? I think that, I mean, maybe this is my optimism, but I think that a fair amount, you would get more agreement than it seems like from reading some of the journal articles. Like, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I bet I could give John Sweller some things where he would be like, wow, that's not right. And Dan Schwartz would say the same thing. And another researcher would say, they would all be like, no, we need more structure here. Or, this feedback, they're not understanding what the feedback is. So we need this or that. Do you see big debates in the research that are impactful for this? Like, where do you see the contradictions and where do you see the kind of, maybe people are using different words or coming at it from different perspectives, but have at least like a basic agreement about what's going on?
Well, I do think when you look at, and this isn't true, I think, just in educational psychology, but true in any field, like, debates can be pretty factious, but there's like a real strong core of like things everyone pretty much agrees on, right? It's just they don't debate about that because the entire academic's career is to make bold claims and then fight about those bold claims, even if those are kind of on the margin of the knowledge that we have, about how to do things. However, and this kind of relates, I know you were wanting to talk a little bit about the research practice gap. I do think that those debates and some of those ideas become slogans, and when they get filtered down to people who are not the experts, who have not seen the whole literature and know, well, it's this, but also the people who they're hearing these kind of slogans, they do get implemented in funny ways. For people who are on the YouTube and do not follow this lately, and they're not sure exactly what we're talking about, like, one of the major debates that has kind of gone on is between sort of more the direct instruction camp, which is like, strongly guiding, this is exactly what you should be doing, versus a more constructivist approach, which is promoting active thinking, encouraging people to do things. And as I said, like, if you look at the actual research and the paradigms where, the active learning camp finds something in their advantage, or the direct instruction camp finds something in their advantage, they're actually comparing things that are, not super, super different. Like the Manu Kapoor's work where he talks about productive failure. Like, the term is productive failure, that it's productive to have students fail trying to solve a problem before you tell them the right problem. But essentially what he's doing is, like, you get them to kind of collaborate and struggle on something, coming up with their own methods, and then after you tell them the right approach. Right? So the right approach is still there. So the failure is like productive failure followed by quick success, right? Like, that's the actual idea. And then even John Sweller's work, like, he had this paper, one of the papers that I cite, where he looks at comparing problem solving versus worked examples. This is this worked example effect paper. And I actually did not even notice this until I was rereading it to do the write-up, that in the worked example group, they're doing practice right under the example. So they give them an example and they could do a very similar practice question. So it's not as if he just got them, like, gave them a sheet of like formulas and just like memorize this. So we're talking about, like, these are fairly similar, but when this kind of, I think some of these ideologies get moved out to the masses, and I think you do get in situations where in actual practice, people are doing things that, like, none of the experts would go there and be like, yeah, that's the right way to do it. I was reading this book by, Stanislaw Dane, the French neuroscientist. He has this book, How We Learn, and he talks about how he, neuroscience, was really a big promoter of active learning, and then he went into some school. I might be misremembering some of the details of the story, but he went into some school, and the principal was like, yeah, we're all about active learning here. We make sure the kids stand up and, like, walk around and, like, do this kind of thing. And he's sort of like, what are you talking? Like, that's not what I'm talking about when I'm doing this. And so I think, the problem, I think, is probably with people like me, people who are trying to bridge this research practice gap. And in doing so, like, unhelpfully simplify or choose the wrong simplification or the wrong, 3-part framework that people run with, and then go in places that, no one who really knows the research would be like thinking, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So I do really think, when I was writing this book, I was very impressed by that responsibility that like no one's going to read all the research. They're not going to check the citations. So I want to try to present things in a way that they're not going to go down like some, detour that they shouldn't be going down.
Yeah, I think you put it beautifully here, how these things become ideologies. Ideology is too strong a word, but they become kind of these
slogans, maybe even,
slogans,
yeah.
sure. Yeah, that's better. That people kind of glom onto, and then but they don't really understand. But I also think it's supported by a devaluation of teaching and a belief that like learning it's like if you have the right tricks, then you can learn, or if you have the right system, then all of a sudden you can succeed really well. And yeah, I mean, I am surprised. I have sometimes I'll speak with teachers, and it's like, oh hey, have you heard of this thing that is extremely popular in the research literature? And it's always a little, it's a grab. I mean, sometimes people have heard of it, or people have done workshops on it, but a lot of times it's like, no, I've never heard of that. In like 30 years of teaching. And it's kind of, and again, the words that we use end up getting in the way, because it's like, is it the case that I'm just using a word that they don't know, but they have actually heard of it in some other context and understand it, but just with the different words, or is it that like they literally have never heard of this? I don't know. I think, and maybe maybe I overemphasize the importance of language in these discussions, and kind of the translation of research into practice. But it's just like, you just can't get away from the language issue, and you can't bring everyone, you can't teach everyone like academies or whatever. Like you can't teach everyone all the academic language, and in some sense it's almost a bad fit to the situations sometimes that you're trying to apply academic research to, where it's like, this research was not really meant to, like, it's not directed towards a teacher about how to teach something. It's actually directed towards like understanding how our mind works, like, and it's just different.
This like basic applied gap is, I think, another problematic area. Like I don't know, I'm talking as much about myself as everyone else here, so I'm aware that like this is the pot calling the kettle black, but like there's so many popular psychology books that just like take some kind of like random study that showed some sort of effect and like out of context, and like therefore this, and then they like really generalize it and be like, you should be doing this or this kind of thing. And often if it's like, especially if we're talking about like basic psychology work, like I really like a lot of the work that like, Daniel Kahneman has done with like bias and heuristics, and, I think there's a lot of valuable work there, a lot of interesting ideas. But sometimes I think the context that research takes place in is missing. That like the context the research takes place in is trying to figure out like what are competing theories that explain how the mind works. And then that sometimes that's like kind of grabbed as a like, okay, well, this is therefore we should do this. And I think the problem is that the therefore we should do this, that's often requires a lot more research than actually exists. Like there's a bit of a stretch between that. So I definitely felt like when I was writing this book that there was I always had this kind of like, little tap on my shoulder to like remind myself that like, okay, I like this idea in theory, but like where's the sort of applied study that shows that this is actually working in practice? Because I think sometimes people have like found a really interesting effect somewhere, but it turns out it's maybe like not practically significant in the situation where you think it would be, or it like flips. I mean, one example I'm thinking of is, I don't remember who the primary author was, maybe McNamara, but Walter Kinch, I know he was one of the authors on this study, did this study on like text comprehension. And it was like the takeaway of the study was that for the more knowledgeable students, the text that had a poorer organization resulted in better memory. And this was like this active learning idea that like, oh, well, if you have a text that's like harder to read, you have to like do some work to form a situation model, and that actually helps you learn it better. But it was something that like you drill into it a little bit. And like, first of all, all that was changed was that they just removed some of the bullets and the headers. It wasn't like they just gave someone some garbled text. It was just very much like they made it like slightly less, you actually had to read it a little bit more closely. And also, like, the effect was pretty small, right? But it's the kind of thing, like, you could imagine that's a very interesting effect. And so, like, Walter Kinch, he's not an applied expert. He's really trying to understand the process of reading comprehension. This is a very interesting piece of evidence for support of this idea of making a situation model and how that plays. But in terms of, like, practical consequences, like, should we be like, oh, these students, this text is too easy to understand, let's garble it a little bit, like that seems like it's going to backfire pretty badly. So I don't know. I think about that sometimes too, that there can be this and I think teachers as well, because they get all these like seminars and things like this, that they get these competing messages. I feel like at some point they just tune them out. They're just like, these people don't know what they're talking about. And it's because of like stuff like this that the person who's giving the seminar is not the world expert. It's just someone who's promoting something, right?
I mean, it is changing, and now I think there are more teacher-led groups and maybe more groups that have ties to research. But for a while, there were these like large companies that basically just make money selling these teacher professional development things, and a lot of them didn't even seem to have a lot of teaching experience on the bench. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I guess this is true of teaching anything. I feel like I experienced this in the YouTube videos when you read the comments sometimes, and it's like, you are taking like everything I said as complete and utter gospel and trying to like jam it into this situation where what I really want you to do is to like just take this idea and use it with your own judgment applied, and I feel like in the teaching context sometimes you can glom onto a new idea and be like, oh, this is just awesome, this is just the best, let's have active learning, let's have people walk around where these people are being super active now, but then
time to get the paper mache out,
right. But then I think what you would ultimately want to cultivate both among teachers and students is a kind of a practiced judgment over time that's like, hey, like this thing that you just came up where it's like, okay, the academic has defined a like poorly organized in kind of a like, I don't know what other words you're going to use for it, but this is why you actually have to read the papers, because the expectation that you have about the condition is different than what the actual condition is. And so it's like, you actually have to know, like, what did they actually do? Which makes reading lots of papers actually, I feel like, fairly intensive, or at least it can be. Some papers are just summaries of other things, but
I mean, every field has their little debates and their things that are controversial and this kind of thing. Reading research that touches on learning and education, first of all, there's no there's a few core cognitive science constructs that are like pretty well accepted, like the idea of working memory or these kinds of things. But when you go to the applied stuff, it's you have these little pockets of research that are sort of unrelated to each other, right? And so you have to read quite a bit to even realize, oh, these two things are even dealing with the same question sometimes, and it like takes you a little while to like see that, like, oh, that's a completely different research paradigm or this kind of thing, and you're kind of like, oh, this is relevant to this other thing, because they can't both be right, or they have to merge somewhere. Like that was my experience with finding Jeffrey Karpicki's work and like some of the other work that's been done on the testing effect and retrieval practice, and then John Sweller's work on the worked example effect. And it was like, well, wait a minute, it can't both be the case that covering up the example and practicing from memory and also seeing the example is better. So like, how do these things combine? And it turns out not easily. Like there's this little like fringe overlap of them sending kind of like dueling papers to each other of accusing the other person of. So it's just this kind of weird field to get into, because it doesn't feel like the field where you have like economics or something, where you do your microeconomics textbook and they introduce these basic concepts, this basic language that like people may disagree with particular issues, but we're all kind of agreed. We're all like the same sort of paradigm, all at the same starting point. And I mean, I don't even get me started about like the people outside of like educational psychology. Like, I mean, if you look at like the anthropology or the sociology, or they're talking about totally different things. They're not even speaking the same language. And so I think it is hard to summarize. It's a hard field to like be like this is whatever, like this is the consensus or this is the right way to think about it, just because of that, just because you have so many different perspectives and it's not always gelled together. Not that there isn't like, at a real practical level, a lot of consensus, but just at the intellectual level, it seems like there's, it's lots of diverse opinions and voices.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I wanted to ask a question, I guess based maybe more on ultra learning than this book, but it seems like, get better at anything is kind of like, hey, here's the research to help you learn more effectively. But in your experience, both learning things, I think you've done coaching and other things and talked to other really effective learners. Like, are there things that like contradictions that you see in terms of what really good students do or what learners do, or maybe even really good teachers do in practice that you feel like contradicts some of the research that you've read, or maybe not directly contradicts, but just kind of opens up questions about, hey, what maybe researchers should spend more time looking into this, or this is something that seemed to work really well, even though maybe the research would say that it wouldn't necessarily.
Well, so I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. Like I have a story in my head of how both these things can be true, but it is one of those superficial areas where the advice differs. But like one of the most well-accepted findings in all of psychology is spacing effect. I mean, Hermann Ebbinghaus and the forgetting curve and this kind of stuff. Like basically no one denies this sort of effect. But the practical consequences of it, I think, are interesting because it sort of implies that like the optimal way to learn things would just to be like break it down in these like tiny little bits and then spread it over this like imponderably long period of time. And particularly when I'm coaching students, they often have multiple interests. And so they'll throw in another one, the like interleaving, which I don't think actually works when you're doing different subjects. I think it's more of a contrastive example, but that's beside the point. But they're like, I remember having a student go through one of my courses and I was advising them to like pick one project at a time, and I didn't have like a research argument for that. It was just purely practical personal experience. Like you're going to try to do too many things. Like pick one thing. Like you want to learn French, just like focus on French for right now. Like don't do French and quantum mechanics and like 8 other things. And this person was like, well, actually I read about the interleaving effect and it shows that actually you want to be doing these like 10-minute sessions and jumping back and forth. And so I do think it's, again, not a contradiction. I think there's totally a way that, like, for instance, like while I'm studying a language, for instance, I really do want to make use of the spacing effect to like the whole space repetition systems for flashcards is very effective in that way because it allows you to get spaced exposure to the flashcards. But I don't usually be like, I'm going to learn 8 languages at once because that's like going to be the most effective way of doing it. And so I think that a lot of, especially the basic research, because of the necessity of like having clean controlled experiments that are of like normal research timescales and like, some of the costs of doing research, they focus on a lot of these micro issues and the macro stuff is basically unstudied. So everyone has lots of ideas about like, this would be like, you can read tons and tons of papers that would maybe weigh in on like what's the optimal way to do flashcards if you had a set of flashcards, but there's very few things that would be like telling you, okay, like this is, if you were trying to learn this language over your lifespan, like what would be the right way to invest time over longer periods, and given the fact that your motivation is going to wane and life's going to come up and like all these things that are not cognitive are going to like impede on your progress. So that's one area where like, I wrote this book, Ultra Learning, which is all about like me taking on these projects in these short periods of time. And then I have a chapter where I'm like talking about the spacing effect. And like, I'm aware of the tension. I'm aware that like, if you're doing something intensively, this is a kind of in contradistinction to the spacing effect. But at the same time, I'm also aware that like, if you're going to, go to a country and immerse yourself completely in the language, like that's not really something you can space out. Like it's not really like you can be like, okay, well, I'm going to immerse myself, but it's just for 5 minutes a day. Like it just doesn't work that way, right? Like they're totally different conditions. So that's one area where I feel like, as someone who's very interested in self-directed learning, or I'm very interested in helping people, like I have this goal, I need to learn something to achieve it, even if it is through formal schooling. Like there's so much good research at the kind of micro level of those little decisions you'd make at like the kind of tactical level, but at the sort of bigger level of, focusing on like, okay, what's the right way to set the goal? Like, should you set a target, or should you just see how far you can get? Should you, these kinds of macro decisions, I feel like are much more poorly understood. And so I rely a lot more on my own practical experience and like experience of seeing people work on these projects when making suggestions there. But that is something that, like, you do get to realize when you're going through this research that there's these little spotlights on questions, and then there's just a sea of darkness that we just don't know. Like, even if you look at the topics that are studied, like there's tons of stuff on reading and like basic math and like maybe a few like college science things, and then like weirdly like lots of stuff in the military.
Like training and research, been big,
tons of stuff in the military, and then there's just darkness. So so it's just fascinating to me because like we're necessarily extrapolating, but depending on which spotlights you have in mind and where you're drawing the line out to, you may reach different conclusions for that sort of in the middle zone space. And so I can respect disagreement there, because I think there is still a lot we don't know.
Basic college science stuff, there's been a decent amount on, but aside from that,
Well, even like physics, you got a lot of stuff that people like so much of the learning physics is the intro mechanics class, right? I've read very little. I would be very interested in like what's the correct way to teach quantum mechanics, because in my opinion that's like the most difficult one, like conceptually, to get to. I mean, Newton's hard, but I mean Schrodinger's really hard. So I don't know any research. Like I have, I'm sure it exists, I just haven't encountered it. But I mean, there's tons of stuff on like the inclined plane problems. I haven't seen a single thing being like, this is the right way to explain what a wave function is. So I mean, I guess that's the whole point, is that like when you're learning, this is I read this book by Jose Maestre and Jennifer Doctor called The Science of Learning Physics. It's like a little short book that summarizes the research on this. And again, it's like almost exclusively, like, you don't even get into electromagnetism. So like if you were just sort of, okay, I'm only going to follow scientific advice when it's exactly about the study that I've hit, then like you've got your first semester of physics, you've got that covered. They've got a lot of ideas of how to learn that, and then you're on your own. And so I mean, that's the way I feel. And your comment about cognitive task analysis, I was overcome when I was doing the research for this book, by this enormous sensation that like we have now accumulated a lot of research on learning mechanisms and theories about how people learn and how the brain works and this kind of stuff. But we have like almost no knowledge of like what is the actual knowledge that's out there. Like what is the content that people actually know when they do things. And I think it was John Anderson who kind of opined about this a little bit, where he was like, because there's been lots of debates and I get sucked into them when I'm in podcasts, like how would you change school, right? Like how would you change high school? And I used to have stronger opinions about this, as I think most lay people do, because you have experience in school. And now I'm much less sure. But I think the reason I'm much less sure is because I'm just aware of this profound ignorance we have of like, what is the knowledge that's actually used in regular life? Like, what is the knowledge that is used in actual professions? And I mean, we guess at it, and probably those guesses from domain experts are not terrible. Like, I mean, if you're an industrial chemist, you probably have some idea of what knowledge you need to know to do your job or this kind of thing. So I don't want to say it's like worse than nothing, but it is this kind of thing, like when we teach kids math in high school that's not job specific, we just want them to generally have, numeracy. Like how important is learning algebra versus statistics, or like how much fraction knowledge is important for people to know so that they can like handle their day-to-day lives. I think that's just, I just feel like there's just like so little information about this. It's just so hard to like even be able to guess at it and say like, oh yeah, well, if people learned up to this, they'd get like 80% of the results. And so we should really focus on getting that 80% done. Like no one's done that study. So I don't know,
To some degree, the nature of learning is that you do not know what purpose you will ultimately put to what you are learning. I mean, obviously you're like, hey, I'm going to learn how to, build brick walls. And, it's like, okay, well, I mean, you're going to build some walls. But there is a sense for a lot of the things that I think people learn both in and out of school, that it's like, you don't know, everything that you have learned has become a part of the way that you process information and think about the world and everything. And so it's like, you don't know when, like are you going to pull an analogy to a Shakespeare
Yeah.
play in this next thing that you're writing, or is that appropriate? Like, do you
Yeah.
feel connected to that, or even, with mathematics, where it's like a lot of time. I had a student a while ago, a long time ago,
Hmm.
who had all this like math anxiety, and just kind of, even though he wanted to do something in engineering, it was kind of like, you don't like he it's like you couldn't overcome the anxiety, or couldn't overcome the reluctance to engage in mathematics by
Yeah.
speaking of its usefulness,
Yeah.
like, and I think that's a pretty common thing, that like, to some degree, especially in grade school and even in college. I mean, the more that I feel like,
Yeah.
the more schooling that I got, the more like I was like, no, it's important, even as you grow, older,
Hmm.
in a higher grades, to kind of open the world to
Yeah.
people. I mean, this gets more into the, I mean, more of the philosophical idea of, I guess, of
Yeah.
preparation for future learning. But this idea of like, you want to give people the option, that this
Yeah.
is something you can do, or that this is a creative. I mean, I'm thinking now of mathematics, like a creative endeavor that is just is very beautiful, and very
Hmm.
like, can show you a lot of interesting things that you can't see anywhere else. And I think, I mean, lots of things are like that. um, um, so I'm not
Well,
even
I think
sure if
my
you do want to
perspective.
tamp it down.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, and be like, well, what's really useful for this? We're only going to
Yeah.
teach. We're going to get the 80% out of that.
I mean, I'm not a
Um,
pure utilitarian, but I think first of all, it's like already the case that a lot of our justification for education is couched in utilitarian terms. So I just feel like if you're going to make those arguments, it'd be nice if they were made better. I guess is not to be like overly pragmatic about it and like lose the sort of romantic part of learning. But I think the other thing too, and this is sort of how I feel. So if you're making the argument that like everyone should learn more and spend more time learning, like I don't think you'll find a better advocate of that than me. Like that's sort of been my whole life of just arguing that people should do this. So I'm hardly one of these like education skeptics is sort of making the case that like it's that book learning's just nonsense, right? You don't need that. Everything you learn you can just like learn from the streets, right? I'm not of that mindset, but the way I feel, and I think maybe it's because I really like learning, that you just become aware of how vast the sort of possible things you could learn are and how deep they go, and like just that it's just this enormous ocean. And so you're just trying to think of like, if you had some sense of like here's some way to even possibly begin thinking about like ordering it or sequencing it or prioritizing, it's very hard. And I think the average way a person does it is they like their curiosity is limited by the questions they can ask, and so they're not that curious about subjects they don't know that much about, and they randomly stumble upon a subject that makes them curious, and they just happen to dig deep in that direction. And if that happens to lead to a great career, that's great. If it doesn't, then it was like a fun major in university and this kind of thing, and then they go off. And the thing I feel is just that like that's obviously how learning works and how learning should work. But at the same time, it speaks to this missed opportunity, because if they didn't have that one class that kind of set them off in that direction, they wouldn't know that it existed, right? And so there's this whole dark matter of knowledge in the world that you don't know. And so like, I mean, it would be interesting to me to be like, like we can think about like all the different academic disciplines is like it's obviously not a one-to-one map for all knowledge in the world. It's certainly not the case, but it's a way of quantifying it. It's sort of like, well, what would be the like you only are able to like read one book in each of those fields, or you're only able to take one course. Like, what would you want to convey? What would you want to tell someone about biology or neuroscience or kinesiology or whatever it is, right? And the truth is that like most people are doing less than that, right? So like
yeah.
even though that sounds like a like a too modest a goal, like people that on average are like they don't know anything about like half the subjects that we have formal departments for. Never mind, the like clearly much vaster majority of like non-formalized knowledge. And so that's sort of my thinking about the whole cognitive task analysis and this kind of thing, is that like if you are preparing people for future learning in that way, if you are trying to equip people for things, it would be like, even just from an intellectual point of view, it'd be very interesting to know, like math, for instance, seems to be one of these, at least in academic fields, one of these subjects that percolates everywhere. Like you can learn the same math and it applies in like many different research fields and this kind of stuff. But it would be very interesting to know like which of the math is like, this is actually like, if this is really important, it's going to transfer. Whereas this thing, it turns out that this kind of signal analysis mostly applies for this particular field or that kind of thing. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know what it would be, but I think it would be nice if we had that knowledge.
I wonder how much of our curriculum, I don't wonder that much, because I think it is largely just cobbled together from different ideas about the way things are, rather than empirical tests of like, hey, like I think I can teach triangles and maybe even trigonometry to third and fourth graders. Like I think I can do that. And I don't even think like that's like, and I think that can apply to, I think we can teach proof techniques to middle schoolers and these, like, and it doesn't have to be the case that it's like, oh, well, this is the, graduate level work that we're having them do in middle school. It's more like, because some of these ideas, because as you mentioned, the depth of these ideas, you can begin with just having a general idea of how things work, and you can work out the details and move in that direction over many years. This comes back to the spacing idea, where it seems like the educational structure that we have now is just so discrete and so like a kind of structured by just kind of what we think might be the case.
You know what? I think the reason I love having this conversation with you, Ben, is because you and I just come at it from like such opposite perspectives. Because you're talking about like, this is how they structure the school curriculum and this kind of like the very top. And like, I always, again, because I'm not a teacher, I've obviously have the educational experience and this kind of thing, but for the bulk of my writing and thinking about this has been focusing on from the other perspective, is that, the people that I'm talking to on a regular basis, people I'm working with, are not typically like teachers or, like high school students or something. Or if they're high school students, they're not usually asking me so much about their high school studies. It's so much more like, an individual who is kind of ambitious or curious or what have you, and they want to learn or get better at things or this kind of thing. And it's this sort of the exploratory process. I feel like that's, the map, like how do you figure out like where you should go next or what you should do next or what might be interesting to you, but you don't know that it's interesting yet. Like those are interesting questions, I think, like I'm about sort of my kind of interest is like, how do you find those books that like are about stuff that you never considered before that can like open you up to something new, right? Like how do you find those courses or ideas? Like, I don't know whether there's even a process to it, but I just feel like that idea of like this sort of unfolding, this kind of a little bit like, it's not quite so, okay, well, you're going to start learning this now because 25 years later, you're going to need it as a research mathematician. Like my idea is more like, oh my God, there's so much stuff out there. How do you possibly funnel yourself toward it? I think that's, I don't know, it's an interesting question, but they're again kind of like they're at opposite problems, right? From the structure of the curriculum to the like completely unstructured environment from the person who's just looking out at the bookshelf and be like, I don't know.
I think there is a danger to having too much rigidity, both, from the learner's perspective where you don't know what you don't know what you don't have access to. And also from a kind of formal education perspective of like, this is the way it is. We're not going to teach them this until they learn that. Similar to what you're saying, I think, I'm interested in like layering things together, and kind of moving, like swimming in the ocean that you say exists out there, and less so of like kind of let's put these people through their paces. I have one more question I think that we haven't gone over yet, which is this, in the book here again, better than anything, there is, you have this framework that we talked about already, do, feedback. Where do you see people misunderstanding these steps or misapplying what either you're talking about
Yeah.
or aspects, I mean, kind of before you came up with this structure, like where do you see people misunderstanding or misapplying what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think so. One thing, not so much this book, because this book hasn't been out for as long, but I can say for my previous book, Ultra Learning, one of the things that I even specifically wrote in the book, like, don't do this, and people still do it. But there is this sort of, there's this real, and I think it's just a human nature, human tendency. They read the book, and like in the last book, I had these 9 principles, which are very similar to how I do the Max in this book. They like kind of cover a particular topic that's I think important for learning. So I cover some research, a story, you know the formula for this kind of book. And and so the idea was that I had these 9 principles that are like basically things that I want you to like keep in mind when you're learning, because these things might be useful to you. And everyone thinks they're 9 steps. Like you do 1, 2, 3, 4, and they like I even had a conversation earlier today where someone was sort of like, well, if someone doesn't do all 9 steps, like are they still doing an ultra learning project? Like it was a definitional matter or something. And I was like, I was a little bit like kind of like even trying to think about what he was asking me. And I feel like with this one here, I mean, the thing that I definitely get myself into, and I knew I was going to get myself into trouble, is that there's a risk of construing all of the ideas too narrowly. So I'm like leaving out stuff that works because it doesn't fit that image that you have. So I have it in the thing. I have see, do, feedback, and that can be a very effective like learning pattern, this sort of practice loop. It's certainly, that's the principle behind direct instructions, behind a lot of successful teaching methodologies, where like you see an example, you do practice, you get feedback. But I really meant the concepts a lot more broadly. So, the idea that you would necessarily want to do it that way, or that see only means observing, or feedback only means corrective feedback. I think the right way of thinking, or how I was thinking about it when I was writing the book, is that these are kind of like factors that influence learning. And so you have to think about like how optimized are those different factors? Like how optimized am I learning from other people? Like, am I actually learning the sort of the best practices in this particular domain? Am I actually having access to high quality examples and high quality explanations? Do I have the building blocks that I'm building up to reach some higher conceptual scaffolding in case I'm like, trying to understand quantum mechanics, but I don't know algebra, this kind of thing. Like that's all under the C kind of umbrella. And then the do umbrella is like all the different ways that doing affects learning. So like it makes your practice makes you more automatic, but it can also have these issues where, you kind of learn either bad habits or, you like we talk about the desirable difficulties idea, you can kind of practice in ways that seem like you're getting better performance, but is actually less efficient. It's an umbrella. It's not just like okay, now I do a practice attempt. And then similarly with feedback, it was talking about all the ways that the information coming back at you from the environment can be helpful or harmful, and like how you turn those knobs. So I don't know whether there's like a remedy for that. Like I try to explain this in the book, but I think it's just a tendency for people when they read through something like this, they want the step-by-step. And because there is no step-by-step, they impose one on the structure that I'm providing, even though like literally every single skill is going to be a little different. Like I'm not going to be able to give you, do this one thing and you'll be able to learn anything. Like that would be nice if that were true, but I just don't think that it actually applies to the material that we're talking about. So I think that's sort of the misconception. Again, with the principles of the last book, I mean, you don't do them in that order. It's not like they're 1 step, 2 step. I mean, I do start with what I think is a good place to start with, but it's not in that frequency. And so I know you are a big fan of mental models and this idea of like, this is very important to thinking. And I think that was something that I came to appreciate more and more as I was reading through this book, that like what we want is a good conceptualization of what's going on in the learning process. So not a procedure, not a list of study tactics, not a like slogan, but some kind of mental picture of like what has to go on in your brain for learning to work. What are the factors that are influencing it? And so that was what I was trying to provide, is like sort of hopefully some mental models, like this is the way to think about problem solving. This is the way to think about, working memory. This is the way to think about that. And it doesn't suggest a specific answer that's the same in all circumstances. But if you have that mental model, you carry it around in new situations and you're like, oh, this might be the problem here. Like I'm having this problem because there's very noisy feedback. I can't learn the signals from the environment, this kind of thing, right? Like that's one of the things that could hopefully carry forward. So I don't know whether there's a remedy to that, but I do feel like, yeah, people want do this, then this, then this, then this, even when that's not appropriate for the particular subject.
Thank you for articulating that. Yeah, I feel like I might just like replay that and post on my channel every once in a while, because
Yeah.
I think that's so fundamental to understanding how learning works, is that there is that you cannot impose this kind of step-by-step process. And I
Yeah.
feel like anyone that ever talks about it, even that talks about it with clarity and eloquence and everything, they still, people still walk away
Yeah.
with this kind of almost mechanical, like, yeah, I'm going to do this and that and that. But anyhow, yeah, thanks for saying that. Is there anything else you want to chit chat about, or
Well,
any other
well,
topics you want to bring up,
weird
or?
weird tie-in to the previous point, and I'm only mentioning it because I feel like you're the audience might appreciate. But I have this section in the chapter where I talk about problem solving, where I get to like brush off all my like computer science classes that I took when I was doing the MIT challenge. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is that there's like all this research about like how certain kinds of problems like cannot afford a mechanical solution, or the mechanical solution cannot be the way that you solve all of those problems. Like there's famously like this halting problem, which is the idea that there's like certain problems in computer science that you can like prove that there's no machine that will solve all of them, right? Like it can do some, but it can't do all. And similarly for lots of even like everyday problems, they're what are called NP complete, which means that, given some fairly reasonable assumptions, there's no like practical way to do them when the problems become more complicated. And this sounds like a really esoteric point, but I think it relates back to what we were just talking about. The reason there's no step by step is because it's one of those problems that you only have heuristic solutions, you don't have algorithms. And like, so if you could kind of like understand this meta point, then you can also understand why that looking for that step by step cannot work, which I think is, again, maybe a little bit too meta, but I think, it's almost deserves its own little point on the side.
It's totally, no, I totally agree. And again, just to come back to
Yeah.
this, one of my more favorite ideas in learning. This comes back to this idea for preparation for future learning, and this
Mm-hmm.
idea of how having the right kind of concept, like if you
Yeah.
understand what you were just saying, then it makes all of the advice about learning more effective that you
Yeah.
hear about learning, because you're digesting it in the right way and you're taking it in the right way.
I mean, that's an area of research that I felt like it was really fascinating, but I didn't put in the book because I didn't feel like I had a really good grasp on like either that it's my fault in not doing the research properly, or it was just that we don't actually understand as a kind of like as a science where we are. But
Hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of research on skill learning, on like how people learn things, skills. There's a lot of things on memory, like learning facts and this kind of stuff. But we talk about Johnson Laird's work on mental models, and his is like a theory of reasoning of like this is how we reason about situations. But what to me is a lot more interesting is like when you deal with like complex conceptual subjects, which is like much of what we're trying to do in academics, especially beyond like there's skill learning, but a lot of what we're trying to do is impart mental models, impart conceptual understandings. There's, I think, just sort of like a much weaker understanding of what that actually is, what that actually involves in teaching it, in learning it, as opposed to just like this is maybe how it functions in reasoning. I read this paper by Micheline Chu, and she talks about how like basically this complex declarative knowledge is this like it's so important, but it's also like fairly understudied. Like it's like we don't have like a really good like paradigm for thinking about it to the extent that we have really good paradigms for memory and like list learning and stuff, and so like associative declarative memory, and also like procedural learning, and power laws, and like there's so much research on those. But if we're thinking about like what does it mean to like really understand physics, I mean we have bits and pieces, but I don't know whether it's not matured to the point where it feels like you can give like the advice that you'd really want, which is like how do you understand physics the way like Richard Feynman does or something like that, which is I think what we would want for our students. So I don't know if you have any takes on that, but I think that was one area where it's like I wanted to know more, and I felt like there just wasn't as much there as I would have liked.
Well, first of all, I really love the research on conceptual change.
Yeah.
And I mean, the phrase like knowledge in pieces, Andrea
Yeah.
de Sessa's work. And so much of that research, I feel like that tries to explore what actually someone thinks is necessarily qualitative in nature. And I feel like in the academic arguments that go back and forth, a lot of the qualitative evidence, I think, gets a little bit shortchanged by academics in other research paradigms. As you say, I mean, I think it is an open question of kind of like, what is this thing? In an earlier conversation, I remember we were talking. You said you specifically avoided using the word schema in the book and used the word pattern instead. And it's kind of and honestly, I think that's a really good move, and it's a move that I think I kind of failed to do in some of the stuff that I've done because I mention it, but you see, even in the academic literature, people are kind of grasping at trying to find the words and trying to grapple with what this thing is, what the conceptual patterns in our brain are.
Schema.
I mean, not even from a neurological perspective, but just from a psychological perspective. But I do think that the work that De Sessa has done in particular, and a lot of his colleagues and people in that tradition, I'm a big fan of it. And I think that the change that we talk about in terms of teaching someone kind of the right way to think about something, it's like we already talked about kind of the cognitive task analysis, or the element of that is like understanding how the expert thinks. Because maybe we can't observe them, and so we have to kind of get inside their heads and somehow. And so there's that problem, but then it's like the learning problem of getting someone who doesn't have the concept to reach the expert level, which I find is something that it takes is kind of built in layers and takes time, time to kind of build that structure that the expert has. And it's not something that is like you turn a switch and you flip it, or they suddenly, I mean, in spite of these, inside experiences, I think it's like it's a kind of fundamentally a kind of gradual process that happens over time.
Well, I guess part of my feeling as well is coming from this idea, and I mean this is again maybe my bias from having a little bit more computer science kind of background, is that I do have this thing like you really understand it when you can build it kind of thing. Like, so when people have like the cognitive architectures where they can like do something, that's like a good sense that you've really fully thought it through mechanistically, like how it would work. And so that's where I feel
you mentioned
like
Anderson's work in the book as kind of an example of that, right?
I mean, Anderson's probably not right, but he's probably like as close as someone has suggested so far. Like I haven't seen any. I mean, now with the large language models, there's a real competitor from a pure connectionist standpoint that would be like, okay, Anderson's wrong, this is right. But I mean, no one understands how those work, so I don't know whether they work that well as a scientific model. But I feel like like this conceptual understanding, like I'm imagining it probably has a lot, like you said, the knowledge in pieces idea. I guess the thing that like was the unanswered question is like, well, what are the pieces, right? Like I understand that we're like acquiring in pieces, but you have all these little different kind of perspectives on the paradigm. So you have people who are doing like this schema generalization, which is sort of like you're seeing examples and you're forming some kind of abstraction or some sort of concept recognition. And then there's sort of like associations of lots of different facts, because experts seem to know a lot about something, and that they know a lot allows them to like interpolate and do stuff. And then there's mental models, are like specific visualizations, like specific maybe objects in your head that you're like, if you're trying to troubleshoot a machine, you have some sort of visualization is wrong, but you have some sort of mental schema of what's going on in your head. And like, as you said about the schema is one of those, I don't know, there's a few terms in psychology. Another one is far transfer, but like it's just endlessly frustrating because this jargon that actually doesn't mean anything. Not that like schema is extremely important, but no one knows what it is or like is really clear what it is. Like they kind of like they know it when they see it, and then you have actually people to define it, and they kind of talk about different things. I mean, like I know there's this whole debate between John Sweller and is it Schoenfeld? I forget the other guy, but they like Speller has this whole idea of like that's what you're doing when you're learning math is you're learning all these schemas, and then Schoenfeld has this idea that like, well, what we're trying to teach with mathematical problem solving is like how do you solve problems when you don't have the schema? Like what do you mean by schema? Like clearly the expert has some schemas in their head and this kind of thing. And so I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's too esoteric, especially for a book like mine, which was already getting maybe a little too into the weeds with some of the research. But it was definitely a question that, like, you know, I was fascinated by because I think that, yeah, deeply understanding things is really where we're trying to go with a lot of learning. I mean, we want skills and we want factual knowledge, but the deep understanding piece seems to be the real, like, that's the real, like, yes, we succeeded as educators. And it also seems to be, you know, the least well understood of the three.
And it's also intimately connected with the research on problem solving, which is, I mean, which you spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about, and which I mean, I sometimes whenever I put a video on problem solving, I feel like I'm like, oh, am I doing a disservice to the channel because it's like, you know, like maybe the channel should just be about studying techniques and learning stuff, but I find the two subjects to be quite intimately connected.
Oh, I mean, encountering the problem solving research was a real light bulb moment for me because prior to that, I hadn't really made the connection. And I think I hadn't made the connection because, again, like talking about like our backgrounds and how we get into this, like I studied computer science around the time when deep learning was taking off. And so there was this real attitude that like a lot of what learning is this kind of like micro adaptation through iterated feedback. Like it's happening on this sort of level. I no longer think that that's entirely true, but I think that this sort of idea, this sort of old school idea of problem solving just seemed kind of a little bit antiquated to me when I was going into it. But when you go into the problem solving, it's just very clear that like, well, problem solving has to be related to learning because learning is how to solve problems. That's all learning is. Like you couldn't, like problem solving is what learning does. So if you don't understand problem solving, you can't understand learning at all. So, you know, when I opened the book with it, it very much felt like a chapter that was a bit of an IOU because I think somewhat pessimistically, like the problem solving, a lot of the things you'd be tempted to want to say, oh, this is a practical application of it, is not. Like there's no real like good, well, this is just generally how you solve all problems well. Like a lot of that stuff has failed and like this kind of stuff. And so, but I felt like it was very important to open this because it's what makes everything else make sense. Like if you don't have a model of how people solve problems, you don't really understand what learning is doing.
Yes.
And so like, you know, so I think you're totally on the right track posting that video. And if it's not appreciated by other people, then shame on them.
All right. I'll let people know. I'll let people know.
Yes.
Other people who aren't watching my videos. Awesome. Well, I'm going to end. I think we're over an hour now. So I guess I will end it here. Thank you so much for joining me or having this conversation. And yeah, good luck. I hope is your book selling decently well? Is it doing good?
I think we're doing okay. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
I hope I hope you get some more people reading it. I really do think it's a great book for anyone who is watching this video. Get better at anything. Scott Young. All right.
Yeah.
See you next time.
Thank you. Yeah. See you.